Welcome to Soft Contact. We hope this story helps you rest easy tonight, wherever you are. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, and what you think about the claims made by Bob Lazar. Tonight we're telling the story of Bob Lazar, a man who in 1989 came forward with claims that would permanently change how the world thought about Area 51, extraterrestrial technology, and government secrecy. Whether you believe his account or doubt every word, his story has become one of the most enduring and controversial testimonies in UFO history. This is that story, told slowly and carefully, examining what he claimed, what happened after, and why his testimony continues to spark debate more than 3 decades later. Part 1. Before the Revelation. To understand Bob Lazar's story, we need to start before 1989, before the interviews that would make him famous, before the claims that would define his life. We need to understand who he was, or at least who he appeared to be, in the years leading up to his public revelation. Robert Scott Lazar was born in Coral Gables, Florida, in January of 1959. Even as a young person, he demonstrated an interest in science and technology that went beyond typical hobbyist curiosity. As a teenager, he built jet engines and attached them to his bicycle, not model engines, but functional devices that actually produced thrust. Neighbors remembered the noise, the experimental nature of his projects, the sense that this was someone who learned by doing rather than just reading. As he got older, his experiments scaled up. He mounted larger jet engines to cars, modified vehicles in ways that pushed both legal and safety boundaries. He built a particle accelerator in his bedroom, according to his own accounts, using it to produce elements for various experiments. These weren't just stories he told later. There's photographic evidence of some of these projects, newspaper articles from the early 1980s that interviewed him about his jet-powered vehicles. In 1982, a local journalist named Terry England interviewed Lazar for a piece about his interest in jet cars. In that article, Lazar was described as a physicist, a designation that England would later admit he simply took at face value without verification. But at the time, Lazar was presenting himself as someone with scientific credentials, someone working in technical fields, someone whose hobby projects were informed by formal education in physics. Lazar claimed to have attended Pierce Junior College, then transferred to Caltech for electronics, and finally MIT for physics. He said he had master's degrees from both Caltech and MIT. These claims would become central to later skepticism about his story, because neither university has any record of his attendance. No enrollment records, no transcripts, no professors who remember teaching him, no fellow students who recall him from classes. This absence of verification would be used by skeptics to dismiss his later claims about S4 and extraterrestrial technology. But in the mid-1980s, before the controversy, Lazar was working at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. This much has been verified. His name appeared in a phone directory for the lab, and he was mentioned in a news article about a jet car event, identified as a Los Alamos physicist. However, subsequent investigation revealed his role was more limited than the title physicist suggested. He worked as a technician for a contractor firm, not as a staff scientist for the laboratory itself. Still, he had been there, had access to the facility, was part of the scientific community at Los Alamos in some capacity. This is important because one of the central debates about Lazar's later claims hinges on whether he could have had the knowledge and credentials necessary to work on the projects he described. Skeptics point to the lack of verified advanced degrees and argue that someone without proper credentials wouldn't be hired for reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. Supporters counter that his technical knowledge, demonstrated through his various projects and his actual work at Los Alamos, could have been sufficient for a black program that needed hands-on technical ability more than academic credentials. In 1988, Lazar claimed he was interviewed for a position at a facility near Area 51. The interview, he said, was conducted by EG&G, a major defense contractor that did work for various government agencies and military facilities. He was asked about his background, his technical abilities, his clearance status. He claimed he was hired, that he passed background checks, that he received a security clearance designated Q clearance, and that he began work at a location he would later identify as S4. None of this has been officially confirmed. EG&G has no records of employing Lazar. The government has never acknowledged that S4 exists, much less that Lazar worked there. But Lazar claims that between December 1988 and April 1989, he made several trips from Las Vegas to a facility south of Area 51's main base, traveling by small plane to Groom Lake and then by bus to the S4 location, where he participated in a program that would become the foundation of the most controversial UFO testimony in modern history. Before he went public, before he spoke to George Knapp, before his face appeared on television screens in Las Vegas, Bob Lazar was a person with demonstrated technical abilities, unverified academic claims, some legitimate work history in scientific facilities, and stories about employment at a location that officially didn't exist, working on technology that seemed impossible. He was about to make claims that would be simultaneously impossible to prove and impossible to completely disprove, claims that would define the rest of his life and reshape how popular culture thought about Area 51 and government secrecy regarding UFOs. Understanding who he was before 1989 doesn't tell us whether his later claims were true or false. It just provides context. A person with real technical interests and abilities, with a pattern of making unverifiable claims about his education, with access to at least some legitimate scientific facilities, and with a personality that gravitated toward the experimental and the boundary pushing. This was the person who would, in May of 1989, begin telling a story that would captivate believers, infuriate skeptics, and remain unresolved decades later. Part 2. The S4 Claims. In May 1989, Las Vegas television journalist George Knapp conducted an interview with someone he identified only as Dennis, a silhouetted figure whose voice was disguised, who claimed to have worked at a secret facility involving extraterrestrial technology. That someone was Bob Lazar, and what he said in that interview would become the foundation of 3 decades of controversy, investigation, and debate. Lazar claimed that he had been hired to work at a facility he called S4, located at Papoose Lake, south of the main Area 51 base at Groom Lake in the Nevada Test and Training Range. He said he would fly from Las Vegas to Groom Lake on planes operated by EG&G, planes that became known in UFO lore as Janet flights, unmarked aircraft that transported workers to classified facilities in the Nevada desert. From Groom Lake, he claimed he took a bus to the S4 facility, which was built into the side of a mountain near Papoose Dry Lake. According to Lazar, S4 was not a large facility. He described it as having several hangar bays built into the mountainside, doors that were camouflaged to blend with the natural terrain when closed. Inside these hangars, he said, were aircraft unlike anything built by humans, flying discs of extraterrestrial origin, there for the purpose of reverse engineering their technology. Lazar claimed there were 9 of these craft, though he only worked directly with one, which he called the sport model because of its streamlined, elegant appearance. He described it as disc-shaped, approximately 30 to 40 feet in diameter, with a central cabin that was wider at the bottom than the top. The hull appeared to be made of a metallic substance that looked and felt almost like titanium, but had properties that didn't match any known material. There were no visible seams, no bolts, no welds. The entire structure appeared to be manufactured as a single piece, or at least constructed using methods that left no evidence of assembly. His job, he claimed, was to help figure out how these craft operated, specifically the propulsion system. This was where his account became most detailed and, for many listeners, most fascinating or most unbelievable, depending on their perspective. Lazar described a propulsion system that was radically different from anything in conventional aerospace engineering. The craft, he said, used what he called a gravity amplifier, a device that could focus and amplify gravitational waves, creating a distortion in space-time around the vehicle. This wasn't propulsion in the traditional sense of generating thrust against air or expelling mass for momentum. Instead, the craft was supposedly creating a gravitational gradient that it would fall into, effectively warping space so that it could move without experiencing acceleration forces that would crush occupants. The power source for this system, Lazar claimed, was something even more remarkable. He said the craft used a fuel that he identified as element 115, which at the time didn't exist on the periodic table. It hadn't been synthesized by human scientists, wasn't known to exist in nature, and was purely theoretical based on predictions of how super heavy elements might behave. According to Lazar, stable isotope of element 115 was placed in the reactor where it was bombarded with protons, triggering a reaction that produced antimatter. The antimatter would immediately annihilate with matter, releasing massive amounts of energy in the form of heat. This heat was then converted to electrical energy, powering the gravity amplifiers and the craft's other systems. Lazar described in technical-sounding language how the gravity amplifiers worked. He said there were 3 amplifiers positioned around the craft, and that they could be configured to create gravitational fields in specific directions. In one mode, all 3 could focus on a single point ahead of the craft, creating a strong gravitational distortion that the craft would fall toward, allowing for directional movement. In another mode, called Omicron configuration, the amplifiers would project a gravitational field around the entire craft, creating what he called a space-time distortion that would allow for the extreme speed and maneuverability that people reported seeing in UFO sightings. He said the craft could switch between 2 modes of operation. In the first mode, it would tip at an angle and move in a conventional way, relatively speaking, falling toward the gravitational point it had created. In the second mode, it would right itself so the amplifiers could create a symmetrical field around it, and in this configuration, it could make the sharp turns and rapid accelerations that defied normal physics. Because inside the distorted space-time bubble, the craft and occupants weren't actually experiencing those forces. This explanation, if true, would account for many of the behaviors witnesses reported seeing in UFOs. The ability to make right-angle turns at high speed, the absence of visible propulsion systems or exhaust, the silent operation, the way craft seemed to hover without any downward thrust that would kick up dust or disturb the air. It was an elegant solution to the UFO propulsion puzzle, which made it either brilliantly insightful or brilliantly fabricated, depending on one's perspective. Beyond the propulsion system, Lazar claimed he was given briefing documents to read during his time at S4. These documents, he said, contained information about the history of extraterrestrial involvement with Earth, suggesting that contact had been ongoing for thousands of years, that multiple species had visited, that humans were of interest to these visitors for reasons the documents didn't fully explain or that Lazar couldn't remember clearly. He described the interior of the sport model as having seats that seemed too small for adult humans, suggesting the craft was built for smaller beings. The controls were simple, almost minimalistic, not the complex arrays of buttons and switches you'd see in human aircraft. The power plant was housed in the center of the disk, a small reactor about the size of a basketball, with the 3 gravity amplifiers positioned around the craft's perimeter. Lazar claimed his access was compartmentalized. He worked on the propulsion system specifically, wasn't given comprehensive briefings on the program's full scope, wasn't told where the craft came from or how they came into U.S. government possession. This compartmentalization, he suggested, was standard for black programs, where workers only knew their specific piece of the puzzle to minimize security risks. His time at S4, according to his account, was brief, only a few months, with visits typically once a week or so. He worked as part of a small team, though he claimed he didn't interact much with other team members due to the compartmentalization. Everything was need to know, everything was restricted, everything was controlled. Then he said things changed. He wasn't getting called back as regularly. He sensed that his supervisors were uncomfortable with him, that perhaps his security clearance was being reviewed or his reliability questioned. He claims he made the decision to document what he was seeing by bringing friends out to a location near the facility where they could watch test flights that supposedly occurred on Wednesday nights. This decision, if true, was a massive security violation. Bringing unauthorized people to view classified test flights would be grounds for immediate termination and potentially criminal charges. But Lazar claims he did it multiple times, that his friends witnessed craft performing maneuvers that seemed to confirm his stories about the gravity propulsion system, and that eventually he was caught or suspected, leading to the end of his employment at S4. At this point, according to his account, Lazar faced a choice. He could stay quiet about what he'd seen and done, hoping the matter would be dropped, or he could go public, using public exposure as protection against whatever consequences might come from his security violations and from revealing classified information. He chose to go public, contacting George Knapp and telling his story on Las Vegas television in May 1989, first anonymously and then in November of that year under his own name with his face visible. This is what Lazar claimed happened at S4, that he worked for several months reverse engineering an extraterrestrial propulsion system, that he read briefing documents about alien contact with humanity, that he brought friends to view test flights as a way of documenting what he was seeing, and that he eventually went public with information that, if true, would be among the most significant revelations in human history. Confirmation that extraterrestrial technology existed in government possession and was being studied and reverse engineered. Whether any of this happened as he described remains more than 30 years later unproven and hotly contested, but the specificity of his claims, the technical detail he provided, and the consequences he faced after going public have kept his story alive in UFO discourse, examined and re-examined, believed and doubted, impossible to fully verify, but also, for many people, impossible to completely dismiss. Part 3, The Element, 115 Prediction. One of the most compelling aspects of Bob Lazar's testimony, at least for those inclined to believe him, was his description of element 115 as the fuel source for the alien propulsion systems he claimed to have worked on. This is compelling because when Lazar first made these claims in 1989, element 115 didn't exist, at least not in any officially recognized form. It hadn't been synthesized, wasn't on the periodic table, and was purely theoretical. According to Lazar's account, the craft used a stable isotope of this super heavy element, placing it in the reactor where protons were fired at it, stimulating the release of antimatter in a controlled way. The antimatter would annihilate with matter, producing tremendous energy that powered the entire propulsion system. He said the government had approximately 500 pounds of this material, obtained from wherever the craft had come from, and that it was impossible to synthesize on Earth because producing super heavy elements required conditions that only existed in certain stellar environments. At the time Lazar made these claims, most people with scientific knowledge would have recognized that elements beyond 92, uranium, didn't occur naturally on Earth in any significant quantity. Elements from 93 through about 103 had been synthesized in particle accelerators and nuclear reactors, but they were all radioactive and unstable, decaying within seconds, minutes, or at most years. The idea of a stable super-heavy element with an atomic number as high as 115 seemed fantastical, possible in theory, but not demonstrated in practice. This is where Lazar's story gets interesting in a way that has sustained debate for decades. In 2003, 14 years after Lazar's initial public claims, a team of Russian scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, working in collaboration with scientists from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, successfully synthesized element 115. They did this by bombarding americium-243 with calcium-48 ions, creating a few atoms of a previously unknown element with 115 protons in its nucleus. The discovery was significant enough that after confirmation and peer review, element 115 was officially added to the periodic table in 2016 with the name moscovium. Symbol mix. This verified that element 115 could exist, that it could be created, that Lazar had been talking about something that was at least real in the sense that the element itself was eventually produced. However, and this is a crucial point that both supporters and skeptics emphasize, the element 115 that scientists created is not the same as what Lazar described. The isotopes that have been synthesized are extremely unstable, with half-lives measured in milliseconds to less than 1 second. They decay almost immediately into lighter elements, releasing radiation in the process. There's no stable isotope that could be machined into fuel elements, placed in a reactor, and used as an energy source in the way Lazar described. Lazar has acknowledged this discrepancy, but he's maintained that the isotope used in the alien craft was a stable form that humans haven't been able to synthesize, that it was element number 115, yes, but an isotope with a different number of neutrons, placing it in what nuclear physicists call an island of stability, where super heavy elements might have significantly longer half-lives or even be stable. The concept of islands of stability is real nuclear physics. Scientists have theorized that certain combinations of protons and neutrons in super heavy elements might result in nuclei that are significantly more stable than their neighbors on the periodic table. Experimental evidence for these islands is limited, but the theoretical framework exists. It's possible, in principle, that there could be an isotope of moscovium that is stable or at least long-lived, though no such isotope has been created or observed by human scientists. So what does this mean for evaluating Lazar's claims? For believers, the synthesis of element 115 is powerful corroboration. Lazar described a specific element by its atomic number, explained properties it would have, and predicted its eventual discovery more than a decade before scientists actually created it. They argue that someone fabricating a story wouldn't have made such a specific, falsifiable prediction. They would have been vague, would have used terms that couldn't be checked, would have avoided details that could later prove them wrong. Skeptics counter that predicting element 115 wasn't particularly impressive. The periodic table structure makes it relatively straightforward to predict that elements with higher atomic numbers can exist, at least briefly. Anyone with some knowledge of nuclear physics and the periodic table could have said element 115 and been reasonably confident that eventually scientists would synthesize it. The fact that it turned out to be highly unstable rather than stable, they argue, actually disproves rather than proves Lazar's specific claims about it being used as a spacecraft fuel. There's also the question of how Lazar knew about element 115 in the first place. He claims he worked directly with it at S4, saw it, handled it, learned how it was used in the propulsion system. Skeptics suggest he could have simply extrapolated from known nuclear physics, perhaps with insider knowledge of theoretical work being done in weapons labs about super heavy elements, and incorporated that into a fabricated story about alien technology. Beyond element 115, Lazar made other technical claims that have been harder to evaluate. He described gravity waves as being amplified by the craft, creating the propulsion effect. At the time, gravity waves were theoretical, predicted by Einstein's general relativity, but not yet detected. In 2015, scientists at LIGO detected gravity waves for the first time, confirming their existence and earning a Nobel Prize. Lazar's supporters point to this as another case where he described something real that wasn't confirmed until years after his initial claims. However, scientists familiar with gravitational wave physics note that the waves detected by LIGO are products of massive cosmic events, colliding black holes, merging neutron stars, and are incredibly weak by the time they reach Earth, despite the enormous energy of the events that produce them. The idea of a small reactor generating and amplifying gravity waves strong enough to propel a spacecraft contradicts our understanding of how gravity works. No known physics would allow a basketball-sized reactor to generate gravitational fields comparable to those of planetary masses, yet that's essentially what Lazar's propulsion description requires. Lazar also described the reactor as being 100% efficient at converting matter to energy, which violates thermodynamic principles. He described gravitational effects that would require technology far beyond anything in our physics, operating on principles that may not be physically possible according to our current understanding of general relativity and quantum mechanics. So the element 115 prediction sits in an interesting space. It's specific enough to be impressive. He named a specific element before it was synthesized, but it's also explainable without assuming alien technology. Knowledgeable extrapolation from nuclear physics could have gotten him there. And the details don't quite match. The synthesized element behaves very differently from what he described, requiring the introduction of an ad hoc explanation about undiscovered stable isotopes. For some people, this is enough to find Lazar's story credible, at least in part. He got something right that he seemingly shouldn't have known. For others, it's evidence of a sophisticated hoax rather than genuine inside knowledge. Someone smart enough to make educated guesses that would sound impressive when they eventually turned out to be partially correct, but not smart enough or not informed enough to get the details right in ways that would be truly compelling. The element 115 question remains, like so much of Lazar's story, unresolved. The element exists. The specific isotopes that have been created behave nothing like what Lazar described. Whether there's an undiscovered stable isotope that does match his description, whether such an isotope is even theoretically possible, whether Lazar actually encountered it at a classified facility or simply made an educated guess that partially came true, these questions remain open, debated, examined and re-examined by people trying to determine whether Bob Lazar is a truth teller, a hoaxer, or something more complicated than either label suggests. Part 4. The credibility questions. Almost as soon as Bob Lazar went public with his claims, questions about his credibility began to surface. These questions would become central to how his story was received, how it was investigated, and whether people chose to believe or dismiss his testimony about S4 and extraterrestrial technology. The most significant credibility issue involves his educational background. Lazar claimed to have earned master's degrees from MIT and Caltech, two of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. These credentials were important to his story. If he was working on advanced propulsion systems, reverse engineering alien technology, he would need the kind of expertise that advanced degrees from elite institutions would provide. But when investigators checked with both universities, neither had any record of Bob Lazar ever attending, much less graduating. No enrollment records, no transcripts, no documented courses, no thesis papers. Both MIT and Caltech maintain comprehensive records of their students, especially graduate students, and maintain alumni networks that would have included Lazar if he'd attended. He couldn't provide transcripts. He couldn't name specific professors who had taught him or thesis advisors who had worked with him. He couldn't identify fellow students who would remember him from courses or labs. When asked about this, Lazar suggested that his records had been erased as part of an effort to discredit him after he went public. He said the government had systematically removed evidence of his education and employment to make him appear to be a fabricator, to undermine his credibility so that his S4 revelations would be dismissed. This explanation requires believing in a comprehensive conspiracy to retroactively erase someone's educational history from multiple independent institutions. Possible, perhaps, but requiring substantial resources and coordination. Investigators did find that Lazar had attended Pierce Junior College, a 2-year institution in California. A physics instructor there remembered him as a student, but jumping from Pierce Junior College to graduate programs at MIT and Caltech would be highly unusual. Those institutions typically draw their graduate students from elite undergraduate programs, not from junior colleges. Skeptics pointed out that someone claiming to have degrees from MIT and Caltech when they actually attended Pierce was consistent with a pattern of credential inflation, of presenting oneself as more educated and qualified than actual records supported. The employment history presents similar issues. Lazar claimed to have worked as a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and there is documentation that he was there. His name appeared in a phone directory, and a newspaper article from the era identified him as a Los Alamos physicist. But when investigators dug deeper, They found that he had worked as a technician for Kirk Mayer, a contractor company that provided technical support to the laboratory. He wasn't a staff scientist, wasn't conducting research, wasn't doing the kind of advanced physics work that physicist implies. A journalist who had interviewed Lazar in 1982 and identified him as a physicist later admitted he had simply taken Lazar's claims at face value without verification. In the casual context of a human interest story about jet cars, there was no reason to fact-check credentials, but in the context of claims about reverse engineering alien spacecraft, credentials become crucial, and the fact that Lazar had a history of overstating his qualifications raised serious concerns about his reliability. Beyond education and employment, there were legal issues. In 1990, not long after going public with his S4 claims, Lazar was arrested and convicted for his involvement in operating a prostitution ring. The details were tawdry. He had installed computer equipment for a brothel and was found to have facilitated its operations. He pled guilty to felony pandering, and while the charge was later reduced, the conviction remained on his record. This was used by skeptics to argue that Lazar was not a person of good character, that he had demonstrated willingness to break the law, and that his word should not be trusted. In 2006, Lazar was again convicted, this time for selling illegal chemicals, specifically sodium iodide that could be used to manufacture certain drugs. He claimed he was selling to his fireworks company and didn't know the buyer intended illegal use, but the conviction suggested a pattern of poor judgment or willingness to operate outside legal boundaries. These legal issues didn't directly disprove his S4 claims, but they provided context for evaluating his credibility. Someone with criminal convictions, someone who had demonstrably lied about or exaggerated their credentials, someone who couldn't provide verification for the most basic claims about their education and employment. This was the person asking the public to believe an extraordinary story about working on alien technology at a secret government facility. Lazar's supporters counter that character attacks and credential challenges are exactly what you'd expect if someone revealed classified information. They argue that the government would naturally try to discredit a whistleblower, that undermining credibility is more effective than trying to directly suppress the information. They point out that Lazar hasn't profited significantly from his claims. He's worked in various technical jobs, run a scientific supply company, lived a relatively ordinary life despite the notoriety. If this was a hoax designed for fame and money, they argue, he would have monetized it more aggressively. There's also the question of how Lazar knew certain things that were later confirmed. Beyond element 115, he described security procedures at Area 51 that were later verified, mentioned facilities and operations that were subsequently acknowledged, provided details about the general area that matched what other workers later confirmed. He knew things that someone without real access to classified facilities shouldn't have known, which suggests he was at least somewhere in the classified facility network, even if not at S4, working on alien craft as he claimed. His hand geometry scanner story is frequently mentioned by supporters. Lazar described using a hand scanner for security access at S4, a biometric system that was uncommon in the late 1980s. Years later, such systems were confirmed to exist at sensitive government facilities, including at locations in the Nevada test site. Skeptics note that hand geometry scanners existed in the 1980s and were used in some high-security applications, so Lazar describing them doesn't necessarily prove he used one at S4. He could have known about them from other sources or other facilities. The credibility question ultimately comes down to a judgment call. Do you weight the lack of verified credentials and the criminal record heavily enough to dismiss the entire story? Or do you see those as potential evidence of a campaign to discredit someone who revealed things they weren't supposed to reveal? Do you find the technical specificity of his claims compelling enough to overlook the problems with his background? Or do those problems make the technical claims suspect, suggesting they're the work of someone smart enough to sound knowledgeable, but not actually credentialed in the ways they claim? Lazar himself has remained relatively consistent over the decades. His story hasn't changed dramatically in its core elements, though details have been added or clarified over time. He hasn't recanted, he hasn't admitted to fabrication. He's maintained that he worked at S4, saw what he saw, and described it as accurately as he could, understanding that his credibility would be questioned and that verification would be impossible, given the classified nature of what he claims to have witnessed. For some people, this consistency is evidence of truth. Liars typically get tripped up in contradictions over time, whereas Lazar's account has remained stable. For others, it's evidence of a well-rehearsed story, maintained carefully, because changing it would reveal the fabrication. The credibility questions haven't been resolved. They're part of why Lazar's story remains controversial decades after he first went public. The same facts can be interpreted as evidence of a whistleblower being systematically discredited, or as evidence of a hoaxer whose fabricated credentials were exposed. Your interpretation often depends on what you were inclined to believe before you examine the evidence, which is exactly the kind of unresolvable ambiguity that allows the story to persist without consensus. Part 5. The Aftermath and Continuing Controversy. After Bob Lazar went public in 1989, his life changed in ways that he claims were both predictable and disturbing. He became a public figure in UFO circles, interviewed and cited, defended and attacked. But he also claims he became a target of government harassment, surveillance, and intimidation. Experiences that, depending on your perspective, either validate his story by showing the government's response to his revelations or suggest paranoia and attention-seeking behavior. Lazar described being followed by government agents, having his phone tapped, finding evidence that his home and business had been searched. He claimed that his employment records at Los Alamos were altered or removed to make it harder to verify his background. He said that people he'd known professionally suddenly didn't remember him or claimed they'd never worked with him, suggesting they'd been pressured to distance themselves from him. In 2017, nearly 30 years after his initial claims, Lazar's business was raided by federal agents. The raid involved FBI, local police, and other agencies, and appeared to focus on his scientific supply company, United Nuclear. The stated reason was an investigation into the death of someone in another state who had purchased chemicals from United Nuclear, but the timing and scope of the raid seemed disproportionate to Lazar and his supporters, who saw it as an attempt to find element 115 or other evidence related to his S4 claims. Lazar stated publicly that he didn't have element 115, that even if he did, he wouldn't reveal it, because doing so would confirm details of his story in ways that might bring further trouble. The raid became part of the larger narrative around Lazar, evidence to supporters that the government was still interested in him decades later, still monitoring and occasionally interfering with his life. To skeptics, it was a legitimate law enforcement action related to his chemical business, nothing to do with UFOs or classified technology. George Knapp, the journalist who first interviewed Lazar, has remained a supporter over the years. Knapp conducted extensive investigations into Lazar's claims, attempted to verify details, interviewed people who knew Lazar or worked in relevant fields. Knapp's conclusion was that while he couldn't prove Lazar's story was true, he couldn't definitively disprove it either, and that Lazar knew things and described things that suggested real access to classified information of some kind. Other journalists and investigators reached different conclusions. Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist and longtime UFO researcher, investigated Lazar's claims extensively and concluded they were fabricated. Friedman documented the problems with Lazar's educational claims, found no evidence that he had the credentials he claimed, and argued that the technical aspects of Lazar's testimony contained errors and impossibilities that a real physicist wouldn't make. The UFO community itself has remained divided on Lazar. Some researchers and organizations accept his testimony as credible and important, citing it as evidence that the government possesses extraterrestrial technology. Others reject his claims, arguing that his credibility problems are too significant and that accepting his testimony undermines the credibility of UFO research more broadly. In 2018, documentary filmmaker Jeremy Corbell released Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers, a film that provided Lazar's most extensive interview in years. The documentary presented Lazar's story sympathetically, showing him as someone still living with the consequences of going public decades earlier, still maintaining his story, still dealing with skepticism and occasional harassment. Critics of the film argued it didn't adequately address the credibility questions, that it presented Lazar's claims without sufficient critical examination. The documentary did introduce new elements to the story. It showed the 2017 raid in detail, with footage from security cameras at Lazar's business. It included interviews with his wife, who supported his story and described the strain that decades of controversy had placed on their lives. It featured George Knapp providing context and defending his decision to air Lazar's initial interviews. For believers, the documentary was an important update and vindication. For skeptics, it was a missed opportunity to ask hard questions and demand harder evidence. Throughout all of this, Area 51 itself went from being a barely acknowledged secret facility to one of the most famous locations in American culture. Much of that fame can be directly attributed to Lazar's 1989 revelations. Before Lazar, Area 51 was known primarily to aviation enthusiasts and researchers who tracked classified aircraft development. After Lazar, it became synonymous with UFOs, aliens, and government conspiracies. The U.S. government didn't officially acknowledge Area 51's existence until 2013, when declassified CIA documents referred to it by name for the first time. Even then, the official description focused on its use as a testing ground for experimental aircraft like the U-2 spy plane and other classified aerospace programs. There was no mention of S-4, no acknowledgement of extraterrestrial technology, no validation of Lazar's specific claims. But the absence of official confirmation doesn't mean Lazar's story died. It persisted, evolved, became part of the cultural landscape. It inspired television shows, movies, books, video games. It became a reference point for conspiracy theories about government secrecy. It made Area 51 shorthand for hidden truths and classified knowledge in popular culture in ways that wouldn't have happened without Lazar's specific, detailed claims about what was happening there. Lazar himself has lived a relatively low-profile life considering his notoriety. He runs his scientific supply business, United Nuclear, which sells chemicals, equipment, and materials for hobbyists and educational purposes. He's given occasional interviews, appeared in documentaries, but he's never seemed to aggressively pursue fame or profit from his claims in the way that someone fabricating a story for attention or money typically would. This has been noted by both supporters and critics. Supporters point to it as evidence of sincerity. If he were a hoaxer, they argue, he would have written books, done speaking tours, monetized his story more extensively. Critics counter that maintaining a low profile while occasionally giving interviews is actually a smart strategy for sustaining a hoax long term, keeping the story alive without overexposure that might lead to it being definitively debunked. The technical community has generally rejected Lazar's propulsion explanations. Physicists who have examined his descriptions of gravity amplification, antimatter reactors, and space-time distortion have found them inconsistent with established physics. Some of his terminology sounds scientific, but is used in ways that don't match how actual physicists use those terms. His explanations of how the craft operated contain logical inconsistencies and physical impossibilities according to our current understanding. However, supporters note that impossible according to current physics isn't the same as impossible. If the craft were genuinely extraterrestrial, developed by a civilization with thousands or millions of years more technological development than humans, their physics might operate on principles we haven't discovered. Lazar himself has said he was describing what he observed and what he was told about how the systems worked, not claiming to fully understand the underlying physics or to be able to recreate it. This is another unresolvable aspect of the story. Either Lazar is describing technology that operates on principles beyond human physics, which means it can't be evaluated by physicists using current knowledge, or he's making up descriptions that sound technical but are actually nonsensical, which means physicists are right to reject them. There's no middle ground that satisfies everyone. The story has also become politicized in ways Lazar probably didn't anticipate. In 2017 and subsequent years, as the U.S. government began acknowledging UFO/UAP phenomena more openly through the Pentagon's UAP task force and Navy pilot reports, some people saw this as indirect vindication of Lazar. If the government is finally admitting UFOs are real and are taken seriously, maybe Lazar was telling the truth about S4 all along. Others noted that acknowledging unidentified aerial phenomena doesn't validate claims about reverse engineering programs at secret facilities, that these are separate issues that shouldn't be conflated. More than 3 decades after going public, Bob Lazar remains an enigmatic figure. His story hasn't been proven true. It hasn't been conclusively debunked. It exists in a space of ambiguity that allows for passionate belief, aggressive skepticism, and everything in between. The technical details are specific enough to sound credible to non-experts, but problematic enough to trouble actual experts. The credibility issues are serious enough to warrant dismissal, but not comprehensive enough to make dismissal feel entirely satisfying. Lazar continues to maintain his story. He's never recanted, never admitted fabrication, never substantially changed his core narrative. He presents as someone who experienced something significant, who went public despite personal costs, and who has lived with the consequences of that decision for more than half his life. Whether that presentation is authentic testimony or sustained performance remains, like so much about his story, a matter of interpretation rather than established fact. Part 6, the scientific community's response. When Bob Lazar's claims first emerged in 1989, the scientific community's response was largely dismissive, and that dismissiveness has generally persisted over the decades. Understanding why scientists rejected his claims helps illuminate the tensions between extraordinary testimony and scientific standards of evidence. The fundamental problem from a scientific perspective is that Lazar's claims are unfalsifiable in the way Karl Popper described. They can't be tested, can't be proven wrong through experiment or observation, because all the evidence he claims existed is classified, inaccessible, or lost. This makes them unscientific in a technical sense, regardless of whether they're true or false. Science requires testability, and Lazar's core claims about S4 and the craft he worked on can't be tested. His educational credentials were the first issue. Science operates on credentialism to a significant degree, not because degrees guarantee intelligence or creativity, but because they represent verified training in methodologies, peer review processes, and baseline knowledge. Someone claiming to have worked on advanced physics projects typically needs to demonstrate physics credentials, and Lazar couldn't do that. Both MIT and Caltech reported no records of him, which would be extraordinary if he'd actually earned graduate degrees there. Stanton Friedman, himself a physicist, was one of the most thorough scientific investigators of Lazar's claims. Friedman obtained Lazar's high school transcripts and found grades that, in his assessment, wouldn't support admission to elite graduate programs. Friedman also noted that Lazar couldn't name professors, couldn't describe specific courses, couldn't provide details that any legitimate graduate student would remember. The totality of evidence suggested to Friedman that Lazar had never attended MIT or Caltech, making his claims about having the expertise to work on alien propulsion systems highly doubtful. Beyond credentials, the physics itself was problematic. Lazar described gravity amplifiers that could focus and amplify gravitational waves, but physicists noted that gravity doesn't work like electromagnetism. You can't focus and amplify it in the ways Lazar described. Gravity is a property of mass energy, a curvature of space-time, not a wave or field that can be manipulated by devices in the way he suggested. His description of the antimatter reactor also raised questions. He claimed element 115 would produce antimatter when bombarded with protons, that this antimatter would immediately annihilate with matter, producing energy. But physicists noted that producing and containing antimatter would require sophisticated equipment and magnetic containment systems that Lazar didn't describe. The process he outlined seemed to skip over massive technical challenges that would be involved in any antimatter-based power system. The claim of 100% efficiency in matter-energy conversion violated thermodynamics. Even antimatter annihilation, the most energetic process known to physics, produces some energy that escapes as neutrinos or other particles that can't be captured. A 100% efficient reactor isn't physically possible according to our understanding of thermodynamics and particle physics. Lazar's use of technical language also troubled scientists. He would use physics terms correctly in some contexts, but incorrectly in others. He'd describe phenomena that sounded technical, but didn't match how those phenomena actually work. To physicists, this suggested someone with some technical knowledge, perhaps self-taught or learned through technician work, but not the deep, rigorous understanding that comes from formal advanced education in physics. When element 115 was synthesized in 2003, some saw this as vindication of Lazar, but physicists noted that predicting super-heavy elements wasn't impressive. The periodic table's structure makes their eventual synthesis likely. More importantly, the element 115 that was created didn't have the properties Lazar described. It was highly unstable, decaying in milliseconds, nothing like the stable fuel source his story required. Lazar's response, that a different isotope would be stable, introduced an unfalsifiable element. If the synthesized element 115 doesn't match your prediction, you can always claim a different version exists that would match. This kind of reasoning troubles scientists because it prevents the claim from ever being wrong, which means it can't be tested or evaluated scientifically. The gravity wave claims became even more problematic after LIGO detected gravitational waves in 2015. The waves detected by LIGO were produced by colliding black holes, events of unimaginable energy at cosmic distances, and even then the waves were barely detectable by the most sensitive instruments humans have built. The idea that a small reactor could produce gravitational effects strong enough to propel a spacecraft seemed to contradict everything we'd learned about gravity from the LIGO detection. Some scientists approached Lazar's claims more charitably, suggesting that if extraterrestrial technology exists, it might operate on physics we don't understand, making evaluation by current scientific knowledge inappropriate. This is a reasonable philosophical position. Our physics is incomplete, and genuinely advanced technology might seem impossible by our current standards, but it also means we can't evaluate the claims scientifically, leaving us back where we started, unable to test, unable to verify, unable to apply scientific methodology. Organizations like MUFON and other UFO research groups weren't uniformly scientific in their approach. But even among UFO researchers, Lazar was controversial. Some accepted his testimony as credible and important. Others, including researchers with scientific backgrounds, rejected it as unfounded and potentially damaging to serious UFO research. The lack of physical evidence, the credibility problems, and the unfalsifiable nature of the claims made Lazar a divisive figure even among people predisposed to believe that UFOs might represent extraterrestrial visitation. The scientific consensus, to the extent one exists, is that Lazar's claims are unsubstantiated and likely fabricated. The lack of verified credentials, the problems with his physics descriptions, the absence of any physical evidence, and the inability to test his claims all point toward rejection by mainstream science. This doesn't mean individual scientists don't find aspects of the story intriguing, but institutionally and methodologically, science has found insufficient reason to take Lazar's claims seriously as descriptions of real phenomena. For people who believe Lazar, this scientific rejection is often explained as narrow-mindedness, institutional bias, or even complicity in covering up truths that challenge establishment paradigms. For scientists, it's simply applying appropriate skepticism to extraordinary claims that lack extraordinary evidence. These different interpretations of what scientific rejection means highlight how Lazar's story operates in different epistemic frameworks, one that prioritizes testimony and circumstantial evidence, another that requires physical evidence and testability. The scientific community's response has remained relatively stable over 3 decades. Some individual scientists have expressed openness to investigating Lazar's claims if evidence became available. But absent such evidence, the consensus remains dismissive. This hasn't stopped Lazar's story from persisting in popular culture and UFO communities, but it has meant that his claims haven't influenced mainstream physics, haven't led to new research programs, and haven't been taught as potential examples of unknown physics in academic settings. Whether this represents appropriate scientific skepticism or excessive conservatism depends largely on whether you think Lazar's story might be true. If it's fabricated, science is right to ignore it. If it's accurate testimony about classified technology, science is missing something significant by rejecting it out of hand. As with so much about the Lazar story, the interpretation depends on prior beliefs and assumptions that can't be objectively verified. Part 7. Cultural Impact and Legacy. Regardless of whether Bob Lazar's claims are true or false, his cultural impact is undeniable. He fundamentally changed how popular culture thinks about Area 51, shifted conversations about government secrecy and UFOs, and created a template for whistleblower narratives that has been used by many others in the decades since he first went public. Before Lazar, Area 51 was known primarily to military aviation enthusiasts and people who tracked classified aircraft development. It was understood to be a testing ground for experimental planes, a place where the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and stealth technology had been developed. After Lazar, Area 51 became synonymous with UFOs, aliens, and extraterrestrial technology in the public imagination. This transformation was rapid and comprehensive. Within years of Lazar's interviews, Area 51 had become a destination for UFO enthusiasts who would gather at viewing locations outside the facility, hoping to see test flights of exotic craft. The remote Nevada highway near the facility was officially designated the Extraterrestrial Highway. Tourist attractions sprung up in nearby towns, capitalizing on the UFO connection. The area became part of American popular culture in ways that probably wouldn't have happened without Lazar's specific detailed claims about what was being done there. Television shows and movies incorporated the Lazar story or variations of it. The X-Files, which premiered in 1993, featured storylines about government possession of alien technology and secret facilities where that technology was studied, themes directly traceable to Lazar's claims. Independence Day, the 1996 blockbuster film, depicted Area 51 as a facility where crashed alien spacecraft were stored and studied, a plot point that resonated with audiences because of Lazar's testimony. The idea of reverse engineering alien technology became a standard trope in science fiction and conspiracy culture. Before Lazar, UFO stories typically focused on sightings and encounters. After Lazar, there was increased interest in the idea that governments had obtained craft and were attempting to understand and replicate the technology. This shift in focus influenced how UFO stories were told, what questions were asked, and what types of evidence people looked for. Lazar also established a template for whistleblower narratives about classified programs. He described compartmentalized operations where workers only knew their specific piece of the project. He claimed his credentials and employment records were erased to discredit him. He presented himself as someone who went public out of conscience despite personal costs. These elements, compartmentalization, erasure of records, conscience-driven disclosure, personal sacrifice, have appeared in numerous subsequent claims about classified programs, whether related to UFO SEDs or other alleged government secrets. The internet and social media gave Lazar's story extended life and reach. His interviews were uploaded to YouTube, discussed in forums, analyzed in blogs and podcasts. New generations discovered the story and formed their own opinions. The ability to easily access Lazar's original interviews meant that people could evaluate his testimony directly rather than relying on secondhand accounts, which kept the story alive and debated long after it might have faded in a pre-internet era. In UFO culture specifically, Lazar became a polarizing figure, but an unavoidable reference point. People arguing for the reality of government knowledge of UFOs would cite Lazar as a key witness. People arguing against UFO conspiracy theories would cite Lazar's credibility problems as evidence that even the most famous whistleblower claims fell apart under scrutiny. Either way, discussions about government and UFOs often involved Lazar, making him one of the most influential figures in modern UFO discourse. The phrase sport model, Lazar's name for the specific craft he claimed to have worked on, became terminology used in UFO communities. Descriptions of craft as having 3 gravity amplifiers operating in different modes, using element 115 as fuel. These specific details entered the vocabulary of UFO research and discussion, cited by some as templates for understanding how alien craft might operate, dismissed by others as science fiction, dressed up as testimony. Lazar also influenced how people thought about government secrecy more broadly. His story reinforced beliefs that governments possess transformative technologies they keep hidden from the public. It supported narratives about security states operating beyond democratic oversight. It fed into broader concerns about lack of transparency and accountability in classified programs. Whether these concerns are justified or represent paranoid conspiracy thinking depends on one's perspective, but Lazar's story certainly amplified them. In September 2019, an internet-driven event called Storm Area 51 went viral, with millions of people jokingly pledging to raid Area 51 to see them aliens. While presented as humorous, the event drew thousands of people to the Nevada desert and generated massive media attention. This wouldn't have happened without decades of Area 51 UFO association, traceable directly to Lazar's 1989 revelations. The facility had become so embedded in popular consciousness as an alien-related location that it could serve as the focal point for a global internet phenomenon. The Storm Area 51 event also highlighted how Lazar's claims had transcended their original context. Young people participating had no memory of 1989, might never have heard of Bob Lazar specifically, but they knew Area 51 as the alien place because of the cultural impact of his testimony spreading through decades of popular culture, entertainment, and internet culture. Academically, Lazar's story has been studied as a case study in modern mythology, conspiracy culture, and the sociology of belief. Scholars have examined why his story persisted despite credibility problems, how it spread and evolved, what it reveals about contemporary anxieties regarding government secrecy and advanced technology. These academic treatments generally don't take a position on whether Lazar's claims are true, but they recognize the story as culturally significant regardless of its veracity. The documentary releases about Lazar, particularly the 2018 Corbell film, introduced the story to new audiences and reignited debates that had been relatively dormant. The film's availability on Netflix meant that millions of people encountered Lazar's claims, many for the first time, leading to new waves of discussion, analysis, and argument online and in media. Lazar's influence can also be seen in how subsequent alleged whistleblowers have presented their claims. They've learned from Lazar what makes a whistleblower story compelling: technical details, claims of personal cost, assertions of erased records, descriptions of compartmentalized black programs. Whether these subsequent whistleblowers are credible or are consciously or unconsciously copying Lazar's template is another unresolvable question, but the template is recognizable. The legacy is complex because it operates independently of whether the underlying claims are true. Lazar changed popular culture, influenced entertainment and media, established narrative frameworks, and made Area 51 one of the most famous locations in America. These impacts are real and measurable even if the S4 facility and alien craft are not. The story's cultural power exists whether it describes actual events or represents a particularly influential modern myth. For believers, this cultural impact is evidence that Lazar revealed something significant that resonated because it touched on suppressed truths. For skeptics, it's evidence of how a compelling story can spread and influence culture even when it's false, how narrative power can be mistaken for factual accuracy. For people in between, it's a fascinating case study in how extraordinary claims interact with cultural anxieties, technological change, and information dissemination in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Whatever else Bob Lazar accomplished or didn't accomplish, he permanently changed the conversation about Area 51, government secrecy, and UFOs. That change is his legacy, whether the story behind it was true, false, or some complicated combination of both. Part 8, Where Things Stand Today. More than 35 years after Bob Lazar first went public, his story remains unresolved. He hasn't recanted. His claims haven't been proven. The debate continues with the same fundamental positions. Believers who think he revealed important truths, skeptics who think he fabricated the entire story, and uncertain observers who find elements compelling and other elements problematic. Lazar himself is now in his mid-60s. He continues to run United Nuclear, his scientific supply business. He gives occasional interviews, but generally maintains a low profile. In appearances, he presents as someone who told his truth decades ago and has lived with the consequences, neither aggressively defending his story against all criticism nor seeking to profit extensively from his notoriety. The 2017 federal raid on his business remains one of the more mysterious recent events in the Lazar saga. The stated reason was an investigation into chemicals sold to someone who later died, but the scope and timing of the raid seemed unusual to observers. Lazar and his supporters saw it as evidence of ongoing government interest in him and his claims. Skeptics noted it was a legitimate law enforcement action related to his business practices and had nothing to do with UFOs or Element 115. No physical evidence has emerged to support Lazar's claims. He doesn't have Element 115 to show. He doesn't have photographs or documents from S4. He doesn't have corroboration from other workers who were at the facility. Everything relies on his testimony and circumstantial details that might support that testimony or might be explained by other means. This absence of physical evidence remains the central problem for establishing the truth of his claims. However, the broader context has changed in ways that affect how his story is received. Starting in 2017, the U.S. government began acknowledging UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, more openly. The Pentagon confirmed the existence of the UAP task force. Navy pilots reported encounters with objects displaying performance characteristics that seemed beyond known technology. These developments didn't validate Lazar's specific claims about S4, but they shifted the conversation around UFOs from fringe conspiracy theory towards something taken more seriously by mainstream institutions. Some Lazar supporters see these recent UAP acknowledgments as indirect vindication. If the government is now admitting that UFOs with advanced capabilities exist and are of interest, perhaps Lazar was telling the truth about programs studying such technology. Skeptics counter that observing unidentified objects doesn't prove they're extraterrestrial, and certainly doesn't prove the existence of reverse engineering programs at secret facilities. These are separate claims requiring separate evidence. The scientific consensus on Lazar remains skeptical. His lack of verified credentials, the problems with his physics explanations, and the absence of testable evidence keep his claims outside mainstream scientific consideration. Individual scientists may find aspects of his story intriguing, but institutionally, science hasn't found reason to take his testimony as describing real phenomena worth investigating. In UFO research communities, Lazar remains divisive. Some organizations and researchers cite him as an important witness whose testimony should be taken seriously. Others argue that his credibility problems damage efforts to establish UFO research as legitimate and scientific. This division reflects broader tensions within UFO research between those who prioritize witness testimony and those who insist on physical evidence and scientific rigor. Popular culture continues to reference Lazar and his claims. Area 51 remains synonymous with aliens and secret technology in movies, television, video games, and internet culture. The specific details of his story, Element 115, gravity amplifiers, the sport model craft, appear in fiction and speculation. Whether as true accounts or as inspiring mythology, his claims continue to influence how people imagine advanced propulsion, government secrecy, and alien technology. The question of whether Lazar's story is true probably can't be answered definitively without either Lazar providing physical evidence, which he says he doesn't have and wouldn't reveal if he did, or the government declassifying information about S4, which it maintains doesn't exist. This means the story exists in permanent ambiguity, with each side pointing to evidence that supports their interpretation, but without conclusive proof that settles the matter. For believers, the consistency of his story over decades, the technical details that have proven partially correct or at least plausible, the government's apparent interest in him demonstrated by the raid, and the lack of clear motive for fabrication add up to credibility. They interpret his credibility problems as evidence of systematic attempts to discredit a whistleblower. For skeptics, the lack of verified credentials, the impossibility of verifying his employment at S4, the physical impossibilities in his propulsion descriptions, and the absence of any physical evidence add up to a sophisticated hoax. They interpret the government's actions as routine law enforcement unrelated to his claims and see his story as either deliberate fabrication or sincere belief in experiences that didn't happen as he remembers them. For the uncertain, both positions have merit. The credibility problems are serious, but some details are difficult to explain if the entire story is fabricated. The lack of physical evidence is damning, but the nature of classified programs means such evidence might be impossible to obtain. The physics is problematic, but advanced alien technology might operate on principles we don't understand. This middle position of uncertainty is perhaps the most intellectually honest but also the least satisfying. What can be said with certainty is that Bob Lazar's story, whether true or false, has been extraordinarily influential. It changed Area 51 from an obscure facility to a cultural icon. It established templates for how people talk about government secrecy and alleged UFO programs. It inspired countless works of fiction and shaped how millions of people imagine the intersection of government, technology, and extraterrestrial contact. The story persists because it speaks to contemporary concerns about secrecy, technology, and the unknown. It provides a narrative framework for understanding why governments might possess transformative knowledge but keep it hidden. It offers a specific, detailed account that's more satisfying than vague speculation about maybe and possibly. And it remains just ambiguous enough that neither proving nor disproving it has been possible, allowing it to exist in that fertile space where belief, doubt, and uncertainty intersect. As long as people are curious about UFOs, interested in government secrecy, and drawn to stories about hidden truths, Bob Lazar's testimony will likely remain part of the conversation. Whether future developments will vindicate or definitively debunk his claims remains to be seen. For now, more than 3.5 decades later, the story continues much as it began: extraordinary, unverified, controversial, and impossible to ignore for anyone interested in UFOs and what governments might know about them. Closing reflection. The Bob Lazar story is remarkable not just for what he claimed, but for how those claims have persisted and evolved over more than 3 decades. It's a story that resists easy categorization as simple truth or simple fiction, existing instead in a complex space where evidence, testimony, credibility, belief, and skepticism all intersect without clear resolution. If Lazar is telling the truth, he witnessed and worked on technology that would represent the most significant discovery in human history, confirmation that extraterrestrial intelligence exists and has reached Earth, that their technology is so advanced it appears to violate our understanding of physics, and that governments have been studying this technology in secret for decades. The implications would be staggering, reshaping our understanding of our place in the universe and raising profound questions about why such knowledge has been kept secret. If Lazar fabricated his story, either deliberately or through some combination of misremembering and embellishment, he created one of the most influential UFO hoaxes ever, one that shaped popular culture and affected how millions of people think about government secrecy and extraterrestrial contact. The persistence of the hoax, despite serious credibility problems, would itself be remarkable, saying something about what people want to believe and how compelling narratives can survive even when evidence is lacking. The reality might be more complicated than either of those extremes. Lazar might have worked at some facility in the Nevada desert, might have been told things or shown things that he interpreted in certain ways, might have filled gaps in his knowledge with speculation or information from other sources, creating a testimony that's partially based on real experiences, but not accurately representing what those experiences actually were. This middle explanation would account for some details seeming credible while others don't hold up to scrutiny. What we're left with is a story that each person must evaluate based on their own assessment of what evidence matters, what credibility means, and what standards of proof they require. Some will find Lazar credible despite the problems with his background. Others will dismiss him entirely because of those problems. Most will probably fall somewhere in between, finding aspects compelling and other aspects doubtful, unable to reach certainty in either direction. The scientific approach would be to reserve judgment until sufficient evidence emerges to make a determination. But humans aren't purely rational evaluators of evidence. We're influenced by prior beliefs, by what we want to be true, by how stories resonate with our existing understanding of the world. The Lazar story appeals to people who distrust government, who believe in the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, who are drawn to hidden truths and whistleblower narratives. It repels people who prioritize credentialism, who insist on physical evidence, who see conspiracy thinking as corrosive to rational discourse. What's undeniable is that the story matters, whether it's true or not. It has influenced culture, shaped conversations, inspired imaginations, and frustrated skeptics for more than 3 decades. It has made Bob Lazar one of the most famous names in UFO culture, while leaving the central question of his credibility forever unresolved. As you rest tonight, wherever you are, you can think about the Lazar story as a kind of modern mystery, not the mysterious lights in the sky that people report, but the mystery of testimony itself. How do we know what's true? What makes someone credible? When is extraordinary testimony sufficient without extraordinary evidence? These questions don't have easy answers, which is why Bob Lazar's story continues to generate debate, analysis, belief, and skepticism in roughly equal measure. Sleep well. The mysteries remain as they always have. The craft Lazar described, if they exist, are still hidden. The truth about S4, whatever it might be, remains classified or non-existent depending on who you believe. And Bob Lazar himself continues to live with the consequences of going public with claims that were either the most important revelations about extraterrestrial contact ever made, or an elaborate story that captured imaginations but didn't accurately describe reality. The story will still be here when you wake, as unresolved and compelling as it's been for 35 years. Sweet dreams, wherever you are, and whatever you choose to believe.